When the story of Selinsgrove is told, it generally hits on 5 moments in time, right? Keep track of these. 1, the Penns Creek Massacre of 1755. 2, the Stump Massacre of 1768. 3, the building of the mansion of 3-time governor of Pennsylvania, Snyder, in the 18-teens. 4, the Canal days of the 1830s to the 1850s. And finally, 5, the founding of the college in 1858. And perhaps number 6, the banana split, right? Stories are usually told about things that last or things that affect many people's lives. This story I have for you today is none of those things whatsoever. So this is a story of a thing that didn't survive. It didn't even exist in the first place. And if it affected people's lives, it did so only in the sense that it didn't come to pass. My story is about the canal from Selinsgrove to New Berlin along Penns Creek. This was an idea born in the 1820s, developed in the 1830s, and dead by the 1840s. The source of evidence for this talk are the professional papers of James Dunlop Harris, who was the canal engineer in charge of this neck of the woods in the 1830s. Among other things, Harris directed the work that produced a surveyor's report of the 12-mile stretch of the creek from New Berlin to Selinsgrove. These sources get us as close to the ground as we can get. I've yet to find any coverage in the newspapers, local newspapers. It might still exist, I just haven't come across it. So what perhaps didn't seem like a big deal at the time was actually this moment in time, 100 or 200 years ago, when this waterway, Penns Creek, might have become a star. So let's talk about Penns Creek and the canal that never happened. Penns Creek is 60-something miles in length from its source in Centre County to the Susquehanna River. And that last 12-mile stretch is what I'm talking about here tonight. The creek survey was made in the 1830s and commissioned by the state government. That 12-mile stretch is moderately used today, maybe not so moderately, as a kayaking and tubing course in the spring and early summer. It's basically 4 or 5 hours of pleasant nothingness. Before colonial officials named it John Penn's Creek, the waterway was called Corundana. Kate Hastings from SU says that that's how you pronounce it, Corundana, by Native Americans who used it as part of a wider hunting and fishing complex controlled by the Iroquois. The land on either side of the creek attracted European squatters well before the first colonial surveys, which were conducted in the summer of 1755. As early as 1749, Native Americans were complaining about white people basically over on this side of the river. The colonial legislature declared the last 20 miles of the creek a public highway in 1771. This meant that landowners had rights to the creek banks, but not to the creek itself. Anybody who wanted to change the course of the creek or alter its depth had to seek legislative approval. And this certainly happened. After 1781, Euro-American settlers started building mills along the creek. One of the first lawsuits that we see in what would become Snyder County was a fight over damming up the creek to make a race for a grist mill. Simon Snyder, future governor, was authorized to build a dam across the creek, very close to Selinsgrove in 1792. 28 local residents complained to the legislature that there were already no less than 10 mills within the site, within 9 miles of the site of this proposed dam. Each with their own set of dams, each with their own chutes, which made travel on the creek frustrating at best. Snyder got his mill anyway. In the late 1870s or 1780s, settlers further up the creek built an improved road generally to the north of the waterway. This drove settlement further to the west, up to and over the mountains on the way to what is now State College. So Penns Creek at this time, late 18th century, was becoming a transportation hub for white settlement, even if it was a chore to navigate it on anything but the lightest of rafts. The story of the canal survey along the creek starts during this era of internal improvements from the late 18 teens to the 1830s. Everybody who's had a history class remembers that phrase, right? The era of internal improvements, right? No? I'm absolute crickets. Younger people who are closer to those history classes, surely you remember. There's even a history major out there who surely remembers. So as the Pennsylvania Canal came into being in the wake of the Erie Canal's opening in the 1820s, aspirational minds chose to believe that a remote town like New Berlin was merely on the outskirts of the larger cities to the south and to the east. A modest pocket of iron ore was discovered close to New Berlin in the mid-1820s. The Lancaster Gazette made the announcement to southeastern Pennsylvania. It was copied in the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm going to pause so you can read. The ore was discovered on the land of John Miller, who was a lawyer and suddenly thought he had plans to be an industrialist. He advertised his ore bed as inexhaustible and proposed to establish an iron works on the site. 1 year later, Robert Burns advertised that he had discovered mines of silver, copper, lead, and iron in 17 different places around New Berlin. This kick-started a round of planning from people within and outside the region. Business leaders in Philadelphia and Baltimore vied for the trade of valley farmers and craftspeople, and so Penn's Creek was swept up in the competition to connect remote parts of central Pennsylvania to urban merchants. Philadelphia newspapers reprinted regional scraps about the advantages of Baltimore's location, warning readers that Marylanders were poised to profit from anything that Pennsylvanians didn't seize immediately. And shipping reports back this up. Boats from Selinsgrove loaded with wheat were registered in Baltimore weekly in the 1830s. Places like this, Selinsgrove to New Berlin, were part of a web of logistics and a network of the imagination. People in this area were concerned that when they did send something like iron ore downriver, they could do so only really once a year when the river was most navigable. This flooded the market with ore or grain and drove prices down. So they dreamed of a full canal system that would allow them access to these markets more regularly and on their own terms. In the 1820s, this area was seen as the up-and-coming place for settlement. A Lancaster newspaper said, quote, "No part of the state affords brighter prospects to the industrious settler than the west side of the river north of the Juniata." It's hard to tell exactly what people in Selinsgrove thought about this, but the elite of the town tended not to support the Pennsylvania Canal until it was actually built. In the early 1820s, before the canal came in, Selinsgrove's bigwigs wanted work done on the river. They thought it would make much more sense to dredge, to cut, to scrape the river to make it more navigable than to build a canal. Union County, and this was Union County at the time, had state reps who were anti-canal. So this was an anti-canal area until the canal was built. Despite this blurb's insistence on the navigability of Penn's Creek, it was not easily navigable between New Berlin and the river. The creek was generally deep enough in the spring to float rafts down it, but this window of navigability tended to end by June and became more difficult downstream from New Berlin. Some of the aforementioned dams across the span of the creek were still there in the 1820s, necessitating further inconvenience. Travel was limited, travel was slow. This was a time in the 1820s when there was a weekly mail service from Selinsgrove to Hartleton, stopping at New Berlin. Every Wednesday, a carrier left Selinsgrove in a 2-horse stagecoach at 5 a.m., got to Hartleton by 11 a.m., spent 2 hours in town, and then reversed the route. And so some within regional booster circles started to push to dig a canal along the creek to connect New Berlin to the Susquehanna division of the Pennsylvania Canal with a more predictable waterway. It's hard to get great evidence, again, of what Selinsgrove people thought, but there seems to have been less enthusiasm here than in New Berlin. There was a lot going on in Selinsgrove between 1827 and 1837. The Pennsylvania Canal was built along the river. The river road between Selinsgrove and Lewisburg was officially laid out. The streets on the Isle of Q were declared public highways. A new Penn's Creek Bridge was built north of town. A huge flood on the river breached the mud dam that separated the canal from the creek. So there's a lot going on. There was also a massive amount of political fighting in the entire Susquehanna Valley during the 1830s. The anti-Mason movement was virulent in these parts. The anti-Mason party got 49% of the vote for governor in 1832, came within 3,000 votes of winning. Anti-Masons tended to hate anything related to Philadelphia, and they tended to despise money spent on canals. But central Pennsylvanians were generally supportive of canals because they saw the benefits of connecting their farms and homes to these outside markets. So in this area, there were a lot of anti-Masons, but they were conflicted about the canals. Local bigwigs lobbied regional office holders who pressed the flesh with state legislators. After a year or two, the project was added as the last of dozens of projects gathered in an omnibus bill, one of these huge bills with everybody getting their slice. A newspaper editor watching from Wilkes-Barre noted that each year such bundling or log rolling produced a spawn of corporations to afflict the people. In 1830, the General Assembly incorporated the Penns Creek Navigation Company, the 26th canal company incorporated in 10 years. The company was to build a canal from Solomon Kleckner's dam at New Berlin to the spot where the creek connected to the canal at Selinsgrove. Lawmakers authorized the company to build a towpath to make use of the creek and all streams to fill the canal with water. They could also alter anything that they deemed necessary along the route. This was the Commonwealth's permission for workers to remove all trees, all rocks, all dirt in their way, and to use any of those elements to build canal structures. Landowners were to be compensated at a mutually agreeable set of terms, and the act laid out an arbitration process that happened when this agreement couldn't be reached. A final clause asserted that the General Assembly, the lawmakers, would revoke all rights to the canal company if the work wasn't done in 10 years, or if the company was found to be doing other things like milling, mining, or manufacturing along the creek. They were there to make a canal and a canal only. Lawmakers had had some experience with companies doing a bait and switch. And you can see why an incorporated group of boosters from New Berlin might try to make money on the side. The canal business was very slow. The State Canal Board ordered a survey of Penns Creek in 1831, yet nothing happened. With the canal not moving forward, some people in Union County thought about a railroad. This was brand new technology. So 1831, just the previous year, the first common carrier on rails existed in the US. The railroad idea was to cut directly northeast to the river. So instead of following the creek, this is where the canal would have gone. The railroad idea was to cut pretty much over to Winfield. In 1833, a 400-acre swath of Shamokin Mountain. So Shamokin Mountain is just up off the screen above Dry Valley. A 400-acre swath of Shamokin Mountain was said to have always inexhaustible iron ore deposits discovered underneath it. Several times over the next few years, the representatives of the navigation company on Penns Creek asked the board of the canal commissioners for the services of a state engineer, the only figure authorized to conduct surveys for canals. The board kept denying such requests. Nothing budged until September 1837. The timing could not have been worse. In May 1837, a financial downturn swept the nation. This would become known as the Panic of 1837. Most Pennsylvania banks were suspended for weeks or months. The credit system in the state was stretched to its limit. 7 years of canal expenses had pushed the state government close to bankruptcy. People complained loudly about corruption and waste within the canal system. The tolls collected never paid for the canal's maintenance. And the political landscape of the state was divided between mainliners, those who wanted money spent only on the main line of the canal, and branchers, those who wanted the canal to keep pushing into more remote areas. If you liked a canal to New Berlin, you were a brancher. But despite the economic freefall and the political winds shifting against more canal work, September 1837 was when James Dunlop Harris, state canal engineer, started his team on the Penn's Creek survey. Harris was the son of a respected canal engineer. He'd bounced around several wings of the Pennsylvania and Kentucky canal system since 1827. His professional wandering was due to the political nature of the job. Anytime the partisan wind shifted, somebody called for a reshuffling of the canal system deck. Everybody would lose their jobs. What strikes you immediately upon reading his papers is that the work of a canal engineer in the 1830s was a tedious combination of logistics, politics, and above all, budgets. Pages like this might be about the structures of specific canal pieces, but they could just as easily be about the cost of timber or travel expenses. Harris spent most of his time begging the canal board for money and explaining why his expenses always seemed to outpace state appropriations. He received warnings from sympathetic colleagues about factions within the state government who were trying to have him removed. And he fielded request after request from family and friends to have nephews and neighbors assigned to canal work. He wrote to one colleague in 1832 that they should abandon all hope that they would ever see their engineering visions actually put into practice along the Pennsylvania Canal. Canal engineers like Harris learned about the politics of their positions in the same way that they picked up the business of surveying, by learning directly from people who had been around a while and knew how to keep disasters at bay. In 1837, Harris was based out of Towanda. I'll put this back up to get it's more spine tingling. Harris was based out of Towanda, so 70-something miles away. He knew this area of Selinsgrove because of two projects that had occupied his time recently. Repairs on Shamokin Dam, which was in terrible shape and constantly leaking, and repairs to the aqueduct over Middle Creek. In April of 1837, the canal commissioners officially asked Harris to arrange for a survey of Penn's Creek, this time adding a request for a railroad line survey as well. So in those 7 years since 1830, railroads had grown, and it made a lot of sense by 1837 to assume that if New Berlin and Selinsgrove were ever connected, you should think trains just as much as you should think boats. 5 months later, September, the survey finally happened. Harris moved to New Berlin for several days to direct the action. It seems like he was barely with the actual crew of 8 men who did the work. It seems most likely that he holed up in New Berlin and he wrote letters. Right? Writing letters was his job, basically, asking for money. The first 3 members of his crew, a leveler, a principal surveyor, and a rodman, were state employees who had been detailed from Towanda. The 5 remaining workers, another rodman, 2 chainmen, and 2 axemen, were hired locally and paid $1 a day. That's about $30 a day to us. That would have been a fortune during the Panic of 1837. They'd have been pleased about $30 a day. The local crew included a 20-year-old, a 19-year-old, and a 16-year-old. And for the life of me, I can't tell that Frederick's last name. Perhaps you can tell me. Frederick's last name is what?
A mystery.
Any ideas? Come tell me later if you think you have a guess. If I stare too long, I'll stop. The survey took 10 days. That's longer than anticipated. Harris wrote a letter from New Berlin explaining the situation. In addition to saying that he was very tired of this place, quote unquote, he said, "All is uncertainty. The crew was bogging down in the difficult terrain on the north side of the creek near Crotzerville. Those 10 days provide a microhistory of this type of dirty, rugged work in the 1830s. Joseph Nesbitt wrote the survey book, which is 15 pages of measurements and notes on the placement of a canal and 11 pages on the placement of a railroad. His source is almost entirely technical, with elevation measurements from station to station on the left, and on the right, brief descriptions of the work that had to be done to position a canal along this path. Harris wrote the report to the Canal Board based on Nesbitt's notes. This source is much more narrative. It tells a story, filtering Nesbitt's technical details through the economic and political lenses that Harris knew he would have to adopt. He was trying to persuade the Canal Board that a canal or railroad was certainly possible in this creek valley if the state wanted to pay for it. John Paxton, Harris's principal surveyor, sketched 4 pages of maps for the 12-mile course. These are wonderful. Together, the 3 sources give us a glimpse of this creek valley's economic and maybe social life from centuries ago. For instance, Nesbitt's notes show that at Station 34, 3 miles downstream from New Berlin, the canal route hit a mill race. Trust me on that. Paxton's maps mark this as Maurer's Mill, and Harris's report establishes that it was a grist mill. Census data can get you to the name Frederick Maurer with a wife and 7 children in 1830. On the creek today at that site, paddlers scrape over the remains of a dam as they pass farmland and a campground. Kayaks get caught on that old dam, and you're forced to kind of scoot yourself with an inelegant motion to get across. Of the roughly 120 houses that sit along the creek today, along this route, 24 of them are the sites of 1830s homesteads. By cross-referencing the survey book, the map, the report, the census, and newspapers, you can build out the path from New Berlin to Selinsgrove. You learn of Fisher's clover mill, of Ritter's sawmill, of the farms of the Walter and Brobst families, and of the existence of dozens of streams and runs that fed into Penn's Creek in the fall of 1837. Most of those smaller waterways are still there. Nesbitt mentions endless stands of birch and pine trees. We can imagine the work of these 8 men inching their way along the river banks or creek banks in September of 1837. And mind you, this was survey work, right? This was not canal building. This was just the survey to perhaps build a canal. It was rough stuff. Within the first mile of the survey, the axemen had to fight their way through a thicket of white pines on a small bluff to the north of the creek. When they'd gotten through that, they descended into a swamp for about 50 yards. This was the state of much of the land along the Pennsylvania Canal route. So the experience of building the canal almost a decade earlier had been one of contending with swamps and the mosquitoes that bred within them. What we call malaria today was known as canal chills in the 1830s in the Susquehanna Valley. Physicians blame workers for their dirty habits, of course, whenever they got canal chills. But this was the most practical route along Penn's Creek, and it would take heavy grubbing to make it a canal, said Nesbitt. It took chopping down trees and building up dry spots just to take measurements. Nesbitt estimated that this type of preliminary work, necessary before any excavation could even begin, would cost 32 cents per yard. The workers scrambled over rock ledges and pushed through waist-high meadows. They interacted with landowners who were surely interested in what they were doing there. Nesbitt's notes list several houses: the Fisher House, the Dunbar House, and the Eckley House, which would have to be moved entirely because they sat on the exact route for the canal. You can imagine the conversations that took place at those sites when the surveyors moved through. The crew averaged just over a mile a day. They returned to New Berlin each evening during the first week of the survey, and then they used Selinsgrove as their base for the last few days. Ultimately, the men did the work for nothing, or at least nothing more than their pay. The canal was never built. Harris estimated that the canal or the railroad would roughly cost the same thing, about $180,000. For us, that'd be about $4.5 million, pretty cheap. But Harris was about to lose his job again. In the months after the Canal survey, Governor Joseph Rittner was opposed by David Rittenhouse Porter for the governorship. Porter was a vocal supporter of internal improvements, but he argued that the canal system had been mismanaged and far over budget for too long. One of his strongest arguments, and it seems to be true, is that the current governor was promising canal workers more canal construction if they voted him back into office. So keep on voting for me and I'll keep the canals coming. Porter won the election narrowly in 1838, and he shook up the Canal Board almost immediately. In his first address to the state assembly, the new governor strongly warned against paying for anything but the main route of the canal. The new board never acted on the budget request for the Penn's Creek Canal. 2 years later, the Canal Commission considered the survey report again when it was crafting a plan to survey the so-called northern route for a railroad line from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh. This is a random picture of the creek again. Seems to have gotten in there unannounced. So the northern route from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, but the middle route won because it was shorter. So when the railroad system was built from Harrisburg across the mountains to Pittsburgh, it took a relatively southern route to Lewistown instead of what would be the northern route through Selinsgrove, up the river and through Selinsgrove. And when a rail route eventually was placed from Selinsgrove to the west, it took a more direct route along Middle Creek instead of what would have been the Penns Creek route. So all roads seem to have led to Lewistown instead of Selinsgrove or New Berlin. The only surviving legacy of the 1837 survey are the maps and the survey book from Nesbitt. The latter is difficult but detailed, and the former is a wonderful reminder of a time when Selinsgrove seemed like it was the gateway to the West. Thank you. Questions, comments, ideas? Yes.
So was the western terminus in the day known as New Berlin or New Berlin?
I'm searching the eyes of people in the crowd who might know. Thank you, thank you. New Berlin.
Wasn't it Longstown originally? Just called Longstown. I don't know when the break was, they actually called it New Berlin to Berlin. But if you look at the little metal sign, it says originally Longstown. Okay.
It's a great question. And Bo says we say New Berlin, but that is not how they would have said it then. Okay.
Maybe World War I.
Oh, because we didn't want to, okay, so somehow Berlin was different than Berlin. Thank you, okay. Other stumpers from the crowd, yes.
When did that change?
Say it again, please. I got back to it for you. Yes.
When was that changed?
I believe we use that apostrophe now for the waterway itself, right? Just not the town. Is that true? That we no longer use the apostrophe when we're talking about the waterway. I think we use the apostrophe for the waterway today, but not the town.
At New Berlin, the sign has an apostrophe for Penn Street.
At New Berlin, the sign the sign has an apostrophe. So it would have been known as John Penn's Creek for a few generations before this, and so people would have been in practice of using the apostrophe. I think by maybe 25 years later, by 1850, you would see it just about even back and forth, apostrophe or no apostrophe in any newspaper. Yes.
Do we know the meaning of Karudino?
Somebody out here does. Do we know the meaning of Karudina? Something about sparkling water. Something about the place of the sparkling water. That's why maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't. Buried underneath this image, I put a little bit of sparkle. Do you see the sparkle?
Nice.
Yes.
Just to add on to the river question, do you know what tribe of Indians were around the Penn Creek that gave that name?
So I believe it's an Algonquin term, but this area was not necessarily lived in as like fully lived in by the time European settlement came. It was used as a kind of transit zone between Iroquois to the north and Cherokee lands to the south. And so by the time European settlers came, the Susquehannocks had been pushed away. Shamokin, what is now Sunbury up the river, had a kind of polyglot mixture of Native Americans. But I believe the term is Algonquin. I don't know who actually would have, which group would have been doing the naming. Yes.
One of the slides in your deck had a set of pictures of like 5 guys. Now, were they quintuplets?
We're all the same person.
This one, right? This one?
No, with the good looking one, the guy. With the year
Oh. That was an editorial commentary on how all these canal engineers were white dudes who looked the same. And we didn't have a picture.
Nice save, man, nice save.
I imagined a yearbook of canal engineers, and you took it too literally. So they warn us that students are using AI. This is an AI-generated image. I told AI to produce a white man in colonial dress who looked like he had been to school. But the names are all in alphabetical order. I mean, it's great. All those fake names are in alphabetical order. Anybody else? Yes.
Was the rail line ever built through Dry Valley, or did it go north of there, through Buffalo?
No, so like all of these ironworks, all these plans came and went when the funding never kicked in. So as far as I know, and somebody out there might say, hey, maybe it was.
There was a train that went from New Berlin to Winfield.
When was that?
I would have to ask somebody.
Okay. I think
I
it,
know the people that had done, I don't know the people, but I knew the family line that had built the railroad.
I think it came in much later, maybe not much later, but later than this. Like this plan wasn't kicked into gear in the 1830s, but that's an interesting tidbit. Thank you. Yes.
Me again, I am curious about the gold mine in New Berlin.
Yeah, the silver.
Silver, copper, and iron.
And lead.
And lead. Yeah, I don't believe any of it. So, I mean,
I guess some stuff.
yeah, nothing seems to have come of much of this. And my source base is newspapers, which might not have it all there. But yeah, I don't believe any of that.
Some of that's like crypto.
But Mary Sullivan has something.
Crypto mine.
Mary has something.
Here's a tidbit though. Supposedly there are mounds on the way from Berlin to Newfoundland that were ancient Indian burial grounds. At one point, there was discussion that gold had been found there, and actually the first female physician in Newfoundland, Sally Kleckner, she mistakenly invested money in that gold mine and lost everything as far as that goes. So it was pretty much a hoax. The gold.
There was a bit of that going around.
She was
Print the certificates and sell
she was related to Solomon Kleckner, or
Probably.
Mary Sullivan, next month's speaker, August 27th.
I hope there's not gonna be quiz questions like this. What year was that? What color was first?
But you don't have to know any of the answers. You don't have to know answers at all for this crop. Anybody else? I've dodged every single question. This is perfect. Thank you very much for coming. Please have some cookies.